Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I am your host, Rebecca Sebastian. So glad you are with me today for a new episode. Dialogue is a weekly interview format podcast where I speak with the most compelling voices in true crime and criminal justice. If I may say so myself, I think my guests are just absolutely remarkable. For new listeners, I was talking to somebody today and realized my true crime family is expanding. What I mean by that is I have more true crime babies. Dialogue is one of my babies. So some of you might know that before there was Dialogue, there was Yellow Tape, a true crime trivia show, which is a live true crime trivia show that I do in New York City. I did do it last year virtually many times with my buddy John Lorden on his YouTube channel and at various other platforms. And I've started a new podcast, which I mentioned briefly here at launch a couple of months ago, but I feel like it's worth mentioning again. I have another podcast called Criminality, and I co-host that with Melissa of Moms and Murder. Now, you might remember way back in the day, Melissa and Mandy of Moms and Murder were guests on Dialogue, and Melissa and I just kept in touch over the last year plus, and we both are a real sucker for reality TV, especially The Housewives, and Melissa came up with the concept of Criminality, which is exploring the true crimes of stars of reality TV, and we're having a lot of fun with that show. So you might want to go check out Criminality. And I bring all this up because I'm going to CrimeCon. CrimeCon is just in, my gosh, a week and a couple days. I'll be in Austin, Texas. I'm really looking forward to it, and it's just kind of crazy because I went to my first one 2 years ago. I only had Yellow Tape, and I was just gonna launch Dialogue later that summer. So I came with postcards, and I was kind of giving them out, but it wasn't really a fully fleshed show yet. So it's really cool to come back just 2 years later and have not just Dialogue launched, but also Criminality. So I will be on Podcast Row. Please come say hello if you're there. I've got stickers and pens and all kinds of fun things for you. And mostly I just want to see you and meet you and learn more about you and chit chat about NXIVM and true crime and all the good stuff. I will also have some Criminality swag for listeners of that show. And I'm also hosting Yellow Tape Trivia the first night of CrimeCon. So if you're there, you want to go to that as well. The best way to keep up with me and my ever-expanding true crime family is probably to sign up for my newsletter, which you can do at RebeccaSebastian.com. There is a sign-up form. Go ahead and fill that out, and then you'll always know sort of what I'm doing and where and when. But I'm really looking forward to CrimeCon. Again, I'll be on Podcast Row. I will be hosting trivia. I will also be hosting Q&As with some of the speakers for the virtual audience at home. So if you're not attending in person, I am still going to see you, or you're going to see me, and you can send me your questions and I can get those questions to some of the speakers, the ones that I'm interviewing. So I'm going to be really busy at CrimeCon. I'm very excited about it. There is also a pool at the hotel. Really excited about that too. If you haven't gotten your passes, I believe they just opened up a bunch of passes, and whatever one you choose, standard, VIP, virtual, if you use my code DIALOGUE21, you can get 10% off. That's DIE-ALOGUE 21 for 10% off any pass to CrimeCon. I really hope to see you there. In other news and business, our Patreon is launched, and thank you to everybody who signed up. I would like to especially shout out my latest two patrons, Mary Jane H. and Karina Michelle. And Karina Michelle actually has a podcast coming out soon called Crime Glasses, which is going to be like a book club podcast, so you know I'm all about that. So thank you, Karina. Thank you, Mary Jane. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Let's get on to today's episode. I talked with a producer, journalist, host, and podcaster, Kathleen Goldhar.
But actually, she was the one who, after the second round, after that knock on the door, she told me about it. And she actually said, I think this is a podcast. And I said, it is a podcast. So it was really kind of like both of us had the same idea that we should do it.
Kathleen is an award-winning journalist and veteran radio producer at CBC Radio, and she was the executive producer of a major news program up in Canada called The Current, and she co-produced Uncover's first season, Escaping NXIVM, which you know was one of my favorites. It was especially cool because she is a colleague of one of our Dialogue favorite guests, Josh Bloch. They are fellow Canadians. They worked together at CBC Radio, and Kathleen just launched a podcast. They're on episode 5 at this point, called Do You Know Mordechai? And I'm going to play the trailer right now to just set this story up a little bit. It is a wild ride.
So I'm going to do this little thing because I'm trying to figure out a way to start.
Okay.
So I'm going to start by saying that this is my friend Aria. This is my friend Aria.
Hello.
Aria and I weren't meant to be friends. And I love telling people about our friendship.
Yeah, me too.
You see, both of us were married to the same man. I married him first, divorced him, then Aria married him. And I love that we're friends.
Me too.
We became friends when they broke up. It deepened as Aria dipped her toe into the world of online dating. For nearly a year, Aria dated men she met online. Lots of duds, disappointments, and some disasters. But then along came Mordechai Horowitz. And Aria fell hard. Okay, so it's Sunday, January
19th,
9:38
p.m.
What happens?
I was trying to watch an episode of This Is Us, trying to unwind from the weekend, kid in bed.
And then there was a knock on the door.
I opened the door. There's a woman standing there, pleasant-looking woman, but it's still Sunday night after 9 p.m. It's like, what's going on? And she said, I think you know someone named Mordechai Horowitz? And I said, oh, you better come in.
In 2019, a friend of mine fell for a sensitive millionaire named Mordechai. And then she found out she wasn't the only one. It was way too good to be true. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is a new podcast from UCP Audio called Do You Know Mordechai? It's launching April 28th. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
As you can hear, this is going to be quite a story. It's going to deal with mental health and friendship and betrayal and dating. And just a little bit of a trigger warning, we do talk about consent and rape later in the episode, so if those are sensitive topics for you, please do listen with care. I loved my conversation with Kathleen. This is a great podcast. I would encourage you to check it out. And with that, let's kill the small talk with Kathleen Goldhar. Kathleen, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good. Well, let's start with your background a little bit. You're coming to us about your new podcast called Do You Know Mordechai? And can't wait to talk about that and him. But first, why don't you tell me about your experience as a journalist and a producer?
Sure. So I've been a journalist probably 20 years now. I started out as a print reporter because my father is a print reporter. So that's sort of where I ended up thinking I was going to go. By coincidence, I ended up working as a radio reporter. Sorry, my Siamese cat is deciding to make noise. So it's not a baby, it's a cat.
Not the first Siamese cat I've heard that I've definitely thought was an unhappy child.
Yeah. Anyways, I got a job in radio here in Canada. So I'm Canadian, and I got a job at CBC in a place called Winnipeg, if those of you who know it. And I hated it at first. I hated not being able to write long sentences and use commas and sort of have a side comment, but I grew to absolutely love it. And it just became obviously my career. And so over 20 years, I just developed into a radio producer, reporter. I came back to Toronto, where I'm from, and I ended up becoming one of the founding producers of a radio program here in Canada called The Current, which is a big show here. It's the flagship morning current affairs program at CBC. And it was an amazing place to be. And I worked there for 18 years. We do national, international current affairs show, everything and anything from geopolitics to books to crime to everything. And that's where I got my start making radio documentaries. We were really lucky. There was money. I could do things. I could travel. So I got to travel all over the world and do radio docs. So that kind of turned me towards the longer form audio storytelling. And then I worked with Josh Bloch. And one day he walked into my office. I made my way and became the exec. And he walked into my office and he's like, I I just got back from holiday. He's from the west coast of Canada. He's from Vancouver. He was out on Hornby Island and he bumped into an old friend of his who told him the craziest story. And little did I know that was the beginning of escaping NXIVM.
Yeah,
And
he wasn't kidding when he said he had the craziest story.
he wasn't kidding. And I heard it first sitting in my office, and like every other person who heard it, my mouth dropped open when he said his friend had been branded and was in a cult and just left. And it was nuts and fun. And we marched over to our friend's office who happened to run CBC podcasts. And it was sort of the first time any of us had really considered. Serial had just come out. And so podcasting was big, but it was really early. And automatically think, could this be a podcast? It just really wasn't in people's minds in the way it is now. And we were like, I think this is a podcast, because we couldn't do it on our show. We kept trying to think of ways, like, 5 long form documentaries or, a bunch of interviews. And so we're like, no, this is what a podcast is.
Yep.
And it was amazing. I mean, the thing blew up while we were doing it. He ran away to Mexico. He got found in Mexico. He got taken to Brooklyn. He got charged and found guilty. I mean, it was insane and wonderful, but it was like the most amazing, baptism by fire introduction to making podcasts. And so that was really how it started.
Yeah, what a cool break, because, his access to Sarah's story was so vital to that podcast working the way it did, and getting her beyond that and after that became a lot harder, right? Because the story, the way it blew up, the way it did, not everybody could just get right to Sarah Edmondson anymore. So that was pretty special.
It was so special. I mean, both of us knew it even from the very beginning. And, just in terms of like thinking about the craft of podcasting, we didn't know what we were doing at all. And we're still learning. I mean, it really is still very a new thing, but we had no idea how to do it. And, we didn't realize at the beginning that Sarah was going to have to be our through line.
Right.
You think maybe you'll break it up and tell different stories and Sarah will come and go. But as we started writing, it was like, no, Sarah really needs to kind of be the person that pulls us from the start to the finish.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting to me because we're here to talk about Do You Know Mordechai, a new podcast that you're producing and hosting. So a couple of questions. One, have you been an on-air host of a podcast prior to this story? And then 2, is not a question, I guess, but more of a statement that there's an interesting sort of parallel between escaping NXIVM, Josh and Sarah, and you and Aria in this story. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that to listeners who maybe haven't started tuning in yet. As of our recording, there are 2 episodes out, but there probably will be 3 or 4 by the time this airs. So Do You Know Mordechai is out, but there's a very close connection between you and the main subject. So talk to me about hosting it, and then hosting it with somebody you're so familiar with, and if that's harder or easier in some ways.
Well, I haven't been a host before, so I don't know if it's hard or easier. I've worked with a lot of hosts. I've produced a lot of things, like the podcast Josh and I did with Escaping NXIVM was just the start. So I have worked with a lot of hosts, including Josh again, and another one of his podcasts called Lost Kids. So I had never hosted before, but I'd worked with hosts, although it is, and I was a reporter for a long time, and being a producer on the show, I did sort of go places and report. So I have done that. I've never fronted anything this big before, and it's nerve-wracking, and I didn't realize how nerve-wracking it would be until it started. So like the week or 2 before the podcast came out, especially the first episode, I was a wreck. I was very, very nervous. And to your point, it was also personal. Like so much of what I've done is not personal. I mean, I feel it, I care about things, but it's not about me. And there's a really personal connection to me and Aria. And so that made me very nervous. I was putting myself out there in a way that I had never put myself out there as a journalist. So Aria and I are friends because we were married to the same man.
At different times.
At different times.
We should
Very
clarify.
important to remember that. We are not. And I was married to him first. Him and I split up. Many years later, he got together with her, married her, and now they're separated.
Right.
And we became very good friends when they separated. At first, it was because I reached out and wanted to make sure that her daughter, who are my children's half sibling, I have a boy and a girl.
Yeah.
Wanted to make sure that they had a connection still through their stepmom, because I knew how much they loved her and I didn't want that to go away. And they were very upset about the divorce. So this felt like a way of me trying to kind of help them, but it turned into a really true friendship. It was more for her at the time because it was fresher. But I think my friendship and my intimate understanding of their breakup and who our ex was very helpful to her. There was a lot of shorthand conversations, but also it turned into a friendship that was a lot of time talking about dating, because she was dating online eventually. It took a while.
Sure.
But I met my second husband online. So I sort of was this and he's a wonderful person.
It can work out. Yeah.
Yeah. And everybody loves him. And everyone's like, how did you get that guy? And I was like, eventually you'll get someone like that. And that's why we were talking about Mordechai, because she met Mordechai online. And so I knew when she met him, I knew all the crap she had been going through before she met him. And then I knew, she finally met this guy that she's really happy with. The question about it being a close friend, it's tough. I mean, I've got to say it's tough. It's tough because emotionally, in terms of our friendship, it wasn't too bad because I'd been through the worst of it with her. We didn't obviously start making the podcast while this was happening, right? Because it just felt we didn't even think about that. While it was happening, I was like, holy shit, how do I help this poor woman who's recognizing that this is happening in her life, right? So It didn't occur to me. Well, maybe there was a little tiny bit of my head that was like, this might make a really good podcast.
But you knew to bookmark it.
Exactly.
She'd gotten through. Yeah.
I've told enough stories in my life to be like, I think we're hitting all the things here.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, she was the one who, after the second round, after that knock on the door, she told me about it. And she actually said, I think this is a podcast. And I said, it is a podcast. So it was really kind of both of us had the same idea that we should do it. But it's hard. And the harder part, honestly, is now. Because her and I spent hours and hours and hours doing interviews. She introduced me to all these other women that she met through this horrible situation. And then it's my responsibility to tell that story. And that's hard, right? Because I'm never going to get it the way she would have done it. I just want to make sure that she's okay with how I did it. It's different as a very independent journalist that I was for all those years where I was covering accountability things. And it was very easy for me to say, well, I'm sorry you didn't like how it came across, but this is the story and that's too bad. And my job is to present to you what's going on. And I don't really care if you don't like it. But with her, it was different. And I don't have any objectivity. I don't have any sense of who's right or who's wrong in this situation. She is one of my very dearest friends. And I really want to make sure that what I end up putting out in the world, she's okay with.
So are you letting her in, or did you let her into the editing and approval process?
No.
So you just have, that burden of just her trust is what you're talking about.
Yeah. I did let her listen to the sort of most final episode of one when it was really close beforehand. And she loved it. So I was like, okay, we're off to the races. So that was okay. But she was not part of that. And none of the requests to speak to the people went through her. None, the women, all of the other people I talked to, I talked to psychiatrists and lawyers, and that she had nothing to do with. So this became my project, and she was very, very understanding of that process.
Yeah.
She knew what it meant. So it was good.
Yeah. Those boundaries have to be in place for it to be your professional project. But on the flip side, in terms of the audio experience as a listener, it's incredibly intimate. And, I really like that. And so you hear it from the minute it starts, that there's no hiding that you're not pretending you're a journalist with this arm's length between you and the subject exploring this, investigative online dating mystery, which we'll get to. You are clearly two friends and you hit record and you're going to share this experience with other people. You're going to let people into your friendship. So I really appreciate that you didn't try to hide that intimacy at all. It's very upfront, and I really, really loved that.
Thank you. I'm glad.
So we've set it up a little bit, but maybe just could you, in a bit more detail, set up where this is going to go? This is going to be a 6-part, it's being called an investigative series, but I also want to know what genre you see this fitting into, and talk us through what themes are being explored and what the main setup is.
That's a good question, because somebody was asking, because on Apple and all those, you have to rank it, and they're like, is this true crime? And I'm like, I don't know. Is it true crime? I mean, I think a crime was committed. Do I think it's true crime? It's hard. I don't want to pigeonhole it, I think, is what I do want to say. It's a story. It's a really good story. As I say in the podcast, it's a crazy ass story. It's about a friendship. It's about partnerships. It's about wanting to find a connection with somebody. It's about being lied to and cheated, and it's about consent and mental illness.
Wow.
Got all those things. So it's complex, but we're complex. And so I feel like it hits a lot of just exactly who human beings are and how our relationships stack up. Nothing can be categorized in one way.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think it will live perfectly well in the true crime genre. I think true crime listeners will really like it because it's a mystery and it's what's going to happen next. There's that element. But all those themes you're talking about are often found at the heart of true crime stories: deception, mental illness, trauma, abuse, So to me, it can fit in there, but it's not limited to it, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, story is story. Like, I'm a real nerd for craft and, like building up a story and a release and then a cliffhanger is true crime, is great love stories, is great everything. So
absolutely.
To me, I was just working on how to tell a really good story that people will want to keep listening to.
Yeah.
So however it fits in. But true crime, I think that's one of the reasons why true crime does so well in any genre, but especially podcasting, because at its core, it's a great story. It's a great narrative.
Absolutely. So we early on learned that she's met a man and she falls for him pretty quickly. They met through an app. His name is, I thought, Mordechai. And she has some red flags actually very early on that she pushes past. She's a kind person. She's giving him the benefit of the doubt. And once she pushes past those, it seems like it became easier for her to sort of dismiss one small thing after the other until maybe you could pick up there. What we discover is that she's not the only woman in his circle and he may not be who he says he is.
Well, yeah, she finds out that his name isn't Mordechai Horowitz. They have a relationship. It's very, very intimate, real. She's fallen madly in love with him. He's fallen, quote unquote, madly in love with her. But there are red flags that sort of keep popping up. And she gets to a point in that relationship where she actually says, I don't know if I can do this any longer. And I need to break off with this.
Yeah.
Much as I feel this connection, it's too much. There's too many things, including he got locked out of his apartment. His quote unquote landlord stole his passport. She never saw his place. She was starting to wonder where he even lived. He lost his job. Like, there was a lot of stuff and then she Googled where he said he was from in California because he told her that he spent his time between California and Toronto. And she Googles what he said his address was. And she finds out that within the last year, it had, there had been a fire, a very big fire that was reported. And when she asked him about it, he, for the first time, wouldn't talk to her about something. And up to that point, he's never been private about anything. So those things, she thought, I've had enough. And I don't put this in the podcast, but she was actually going away on a conference and sort of used that as like a way of saying, like, I need a break from you. And she was away, and the time away gave her the sort of energy and the realization that she needed the space. So she just broke off with him. But then come November, and we're from Toronto, and it gets cold, and it was a cold night, and she started wondering if he was homeless and outside, and she texted him, and that just started it up. And that's when he told her, you're right, I lied about a whole bunch of things. I lied to you about my name. It's not Mordechai Horowitz. I lied to you about being from California. I'm not American. I'm Canadian. I'm from Toronto. I'm not an artist. I'm not a farmer. I don't have a ranch. Like, he told her all of these things. And I remember when she told me that, and I was like, stop talking to him. Mm-hmm. She's like, I'm not going to get back together. I'm not going to get back together with him. I just kind of want to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, sure enough, within about a week and a half of them talking, they were back together. Not surprised. Like, honestly, I was not surprised. And I say it in the podcast, and it's very true. She is the most kind person. Mm-hmm. And she, in her own heart, she didn't want somebody who had a mental health issue to be the reason why she stopped a relationship.
So generous. Yeah.
So generous, right? And it is what all of us progressives talk about. Mm-hmm. That is not a reason to knock somebody out of your life. Very true. So I got what she was doing. I get it. Anyways, they got back together, and then Sunday night in January, 9:00 at night, she gets a knock on the door. It's a woman standing outside, and the woman says to her, she actually knew her name. She said, hi, are you Aria? And she said, yes. And she said, do you know Mordechai Horowitz? And that was the beginning of everything falling apart. They talked on the doorstep for hours. Aria found out there were all these other women. There were lies about so many things. It was more he lied to her about, which I still don't quite understand. To me, this feels like the most typical con man thing, but the millionaire thing, he told that to a lot of women, and a lot of women continued to believe him, that money was tied up in some weird thing, that his dad was a financier. And
yeah.
They all believed it, but he presented himself very comfortably wealthy. And I don't know how to explain that well, but he comes across as somebody who would have been raised and comfortable around people with money.
Yes.
And so I guess he tricked them. Anyways, that all fell away. He was not rich. He was homeless. He was homeless because he was homeless, not because he couldn't access his money. And there were lots of other women, and there were more children than he had said there were children, some older, some younger, different ex-wives or ex-partners. Anyways, a whole cauldron of total bullshit and lies that all of a sudden were all made apparent.
Brush is an electric toothbrush that will change the way you think about brushing your teeth. With powerful sonic technology and ultra gentle bristles, the Brush redefines what it means to have super clean teeth. It's like that feeling when you just leave the dentist, a fresh, whole mouth clean every single day. And those ultra gentle bristles, that is for me. My dentist always asks me, what did your gums ever do to you? Apparently, I am damaging them by the way I brush so aggressively, so I am very excited to get my Brush. And you can get yours too. DIE-ALOGUE listeners are going to get 15% off their total purchase with the code POD15. That's POD15. Follow the link in the show notes, enter the code POD15 to get your exclusive discount and upgrade your oral care routine with Brush. You know, it's reminding me of Anna Delvey. I don't know if you know her story, right? But she took on this heiress persona, totally scammed people, whereas the financial component to hers really was criminal. And I don't know if that happens with Mordechai. That's one of my questions, which we'll get to. But I mean, for Anna, she was convicted, but she was very comfortable in those circles. And so when somebody, I guess, what reason do you have to not believe somebody who ends up at certain cocktail parties with certain people? You're like, well, why shouldn't she be here? And why wouldn't that be true? To where she got a group of girlfriends on an expensive trip to Morocco and got other people to pay for the whole thing. I mean, it's pretty wild. So it does happen. I don't think it, says anything bad about her believing it or any of the women.
I think it actually says good things about humanity. I think the reason it happens so much is because most of us don't lie that badly.
Right.
Don't take that kind of advantage of people. And so don't think that it's happening to you. I really think that's why it happens. If we were all a bunch of crooks, horrible people, we would be suspicious of everybody all the time. And now what I know Aria finds tiring is that she's suspicious, and that has changed. That's unfortunate. And she wasn't suspicious, but you can't drop it after this kind of thing happens to you.
Yeah. If you've not been given a reason to not believe people and what they say, then why wouldn't you?
Exactly.
So does his motive ever become clear? Because from what I've listened so far, there doesn't seem to be, he's not trying to get cash per se. He's definitely, it sounds like, probably staying with people when it works out for him. And that's probably very helpful if he doesn't have his own place. But it doesn't seem like he's stealing or extorting or being sneaky about money. So does that ever happen? And if not, what's the motive?
Yeah, he's not stealing. He's not. He does take money here and there. Mm-hmm. He takes $50 sometimes. He takes $20. Sometimes when he has money, he pays for things. He takes them for dinner and he pays. So no, not the motivation. There is one woman in his past who he did take about $50,000 from, but he's been paying her back still. Like, he admitted it. It's not money. I mean, I get more into, and that's when I said that there's mental health. So I do get into the mental health question later on in episode 6. I do talk to a psychiatrist who's an expert in pathological lying.
Fantastic.
And we break down and we sort of get pretty close to figuring out what's going on with him. So it is a mental health issue. He's not violent. He's not extorting these women. He is often homeless. And I believe that the motivation is a place to stay. Possibly the warmth of a cooked meal and just being in somebody's home. That's a lot nicer than being in a shelter. And the motivation is the same as the women. The motivation is to find a person. But he is so damaged that he doesn't tell you who he is. He has to manipulate. He has to make up who he is to feel like he can get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other. And so sadly, the women also wanted a person and wanted a connection.
Yeah.
But they went into it open and honestly. thinking that they were making a connection when they weren't. So it's the same. It's sad. At least that's what I think.
So does that psychiatric perspective that you get later into the series, which you don't have to divulge now entirely, but does it increase your empathy for him? And does that complicate the story because we kind of want a bad guy?
Yes. Yeah. It complicates it a lot. But, you know, Arya and I have talked about it too. And Arya has gotten to that same place because she's a good person. You can't help it. You just can't. It doesn't take away what he did. And long time having dealt with other people in my life who had mental health and did bad things to people, it's not an excuse for the bad action.
Right.
You don't excuse them. You don't say that your pain from having lived through that experience gets taken away because they have a reason for behaving that way. So once you kind of see it that way, you can still feel bad that this guy is so pathetic, is so damaged, that he is so unhappy with who he is. Just like it's almost textbook. I mean, it is textbook. He's so unhappy with who he is that he has to become somebody else.
Right.
That you have to feel bad for him, but it does not take away the harm. I was on a program this morning on The Current, which is a big show in Canada. I just got an email from somebody saying, help, he's my friend's boyfriend. We're going over there right now to tell her how can she connect to these women.
Gosh.
It's happening. I'm sure. Like, I have no idea what's on my phone. Like, it's been blowing. I have a watch. It's like blowing up on me right now. And I'm sure that I'm getting lots of emails.
Oh my gosh. So it's still an active and present, I don't know if threat is too strong, but
it's a threat.
He's still out there operating. And you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking about how I'm pretty naturally a sympathetic person, but that I also probably consume too much true crime. So there's this, probably it makes for a healthy balance, but I'm thinking not only is it dangerous what he's done because there's been a violation of trust, but it could predict future behavior that could become more extreme over time. Like, I'm thinking Scott Peterson is the last guy we heard who said his wife was dead when in fact she was very much alive. He said to a girlfriend he was having an affair with, and we all know how that story played out, or I don't know if you know, it's American, but it's a pretty big true crime case.
Yeah.
Right. And then Dirty John Meehan, who that was much more financially driven, but he ended up going to the extreme of kidnapping the person he was seeing's daughter, who she ended up fighting for her life and killing him. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that his behavior could escalate. So there's a danger inherent in that too. Did the psychologist or psychiatrist speak about that at all?
He said that in Mark's case, it was more violence against himself than anybody else.
Okay.
I haven't seen any violent. I know the women have in the past, been worried about their safety, and they're not about to like invite him in or have a cup of tea with him again. I think that's relaxed. I think they realize that he doesn't have that intention, but for sure, it could. I don't think that's the case now with him.
Good.
But I definitely can understand why there would be fear that it would be.
Yeah. Yeah. So also, this brings up an interesting thing that comes up in true crime a lot, which is doxing and identity, revealing people's identities when they don't want to. So you're obviously trying to protect the women in the story, not using their real names. Now, Mordechai Horowitz isn't his real name, but it's the name he gave to all these women. Is that the actual name he used?
What I did was because I reached and I've spoken to so many women over the years, I've gone back really far. You see it develop. So first he's Mark, then he becomes Mark Mordechai, then he becomes Mordechai. So what he says is that he starts to tell some women that he's Jewish, which he's not, but Mordecai is his Jewish name, and he'd rather go by Mordecai. So he starts to tell people that his name is Mark, but he wants to go by Mordecai. And then once he meets my friend Arya, he's fully Mordecai. Okay.
And so did you use the name he was actually using on purpose as a warning? Because you're still getting these messages now like, oh, I mean, it's a very memorable name. So if people have had an encounter or their friend has, they're going to know, and that flag and that bell is going to go off. Did you do that intentionally? And then also, how do you prevent, or can you, I doubt it, people from getting online and figuring out who this guy is and revealing it?
Well, I do say his real name in the podcast.
Yeah, that's true. You do.
Yeah. So I don't hide. I just, the way that I've written it is that the first episode is you know him the way Arya knows him until Arya knows him as Mark. And then in the future episodes, it was a bit complicated because you're like, do we call him Mark? Do we call him Mordecai? The way we've written it is that if it's talking about a story where the person who's in that story knows him as Mordecai, then I tell it as Mordecai. When I'm talking about him now, I say it's Mark.
Gotcha.
So it just depends on from the point of view. So I do, and there's nothing I can do to stop anybody.
So legally, how do you get around that? Is that just okay to do? And I know this is getting a little granular. Okay.
It is okay to do. I reach out to him, and I guess you have to find out whether or not
he responds.
Okay.
So maybe you interact with him, maybe you don't. We don't know. We're all gonna have to listen. Dang it. Okay. And then what about Aria?
But aside, it is granular, but I am allowed. In some states it's the same. We have lawyers, we have insurance. I've been a journalist for 20 years. I know the rules, and this is he did something. Anybody can tell their story.
Sure.
And he just happened to be the one who's the story's about. So yeah, we're allowed to tell it.
Gotcha. I always just love to hear a bit about the thinking behind those choices. But for Aria and the other women, how that's such a big responsibility to protect their identity. And I think people are just curious. And so there could be some investigating, some people sitting at their desk going like, who is Aria actually? Have you encountered that yet? Do you think you will?
I haven't yet. It's just new, right?
Yeah, it's very new.
It's picking up steam, I hope. So no, that hasn't happened. I mean, there's not really too much identifying. Like, I don't really say what anybody does for a living. I do say what city they're in, but that's it. So it would be kind of hard. My Facebook page is pretty private and clamped down on, so I'm not going to make it public so that people can go. But at the same time, it'd be pretty hard. Like, I have a lot of girlfriends, so it'd be pretty hard to find her.
That makes perfect sense. So what did you learn about catfishing through this investigation and storytelling? Because it's relatively new, but it's been going on for a while. And as the internet gets better and technology improves, I mean, this guy doesn't have a lot of resources, but he has a phone. It's all you need, and some apps. So what did you learn about catfishing?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I didn't specifically focus on that part of the story too much, but as we're talking, and what I'm thinking about is, one, it's friggin' easy. You need a phone. But one of the things that astounds me about him is his ability to use images is incredible. He has I'm sure his phone has such a bank of pictures. These women, the number of photographs that he would send them to bolster his stories were amazing. I don't know how he kept it straight. His phone must be organized in such a spectacular way, because he sends them pictures that he's like, I'm at so-and-so, and there's a picture. I'm so-and-so. And if you get a picture, and again, it goes back just being decent people, you're like, well, that's that.
Yeah.
But he sent pictures to women saying that he was in California when he was in Toronto, because he had one trip to California, and he has this tons of photos of his best friend Justine, or his ex-wife Justine, or his dead wife Justine, that he sends out all the time. And he also does things like take pictures of himself at some of the women's houses, and when they got together, they started to recognize their houses in these pictures. They're like, That's in my house. You took the picture of my house.
So creepy.
It was crazy, so creepy. So to me, that's what it is. It's a real understanding of images and the use of images, and how easy it is. Really just how easy it is. Change your phone number and stuff. You can hide. Also, I'm slightly older, so I don't do it, but he always had different phone numbers for people. And one of the things that he did was he would pretend to be other people and just use a different phone number.
For texting?
Yeah, so he'd get the internet number, hide it on his phone, replace his number. So he'd be texting you as Mark, and then you'd be getting a thing from his cousin that he'd introduced you to. It was him.
And while that isn't violent per se, there is something scary about that when you realize it. That would chill me to my bones if I figured that out.
It's horrible. It's what else? What's not real? It's just feeling.
And speaking of images, there is a part, I don't know, might have been in episode 3, where you're talking about even the slight variations of his appearance from photo to photo that he sends the women. It's almost like versions of himself for each of the women. Now, short of dyeing your hair, women have much easier time, generally, stereotypically, of changing the way we look in photos. Men, it's kind of harder. But you talk about his expressions, demeanor, the way he's carrying himself, and his hair. Even to that extent, he seemed to be organized in the way he was portraying himself.
Yeah, well, the woman in California, Justine, told me that, and I think she's right, she was the one who said it, that he molds himself to the perfect man for you.
Oh,
So if you want somebody who's like the uptight IT guy who can get things done and is an A-type personality, and that's who's going to be for you. If you want to be the artistic, crunchy granola farmer who Aria wanted, that's who he's going to be. So he'll have the pictures of him in the t-shirt and the jeans. And I don't know, like there's probably pictures of him from many years ago, right? So he keeps them all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes when I hear stories of con men or con women, which I don't know if you would call them that. That's a good question.
Yep.
Okay.
Man.
I think about how much work and energy and bandwidth it takes. And I think if he put that into an honest, creative place, he'd probably be very successful. And even with all his mental health struggles, of which, you know, many of us have and have jobs and families and friendships, he might be a good person for one of these women. Right? It kind of breaks my heart to think how much he's pouring into the deception when it could go somewhere healthy where he could have a life of his own.
I said that all the time. The story he crafted of himself is amazing. It's really sad. And yes, even his ability to manage the pictures on his phone and to manage the lies.
That's a skill set.
It's a skill set. And his narrative development, I'm like, too bad you're not a podcast writer. Like, you know what you're doing. You know how to write and tell these stories. The terrible thing is that you're fucking pretending they're all real and lying to women. Right. It's a really interesting thing.
And there has to be a power element to it. I can't imagine you're not getting some feeling of getting one over on people feels good. I mean, it's gross, but it's human. And so if he's constantly being able to do that, that must be part of what keeps him going, is the addiction to that feeling.
You know, obviously not speaking for him, but yes, I can't imagine it's not.
Yeah. So as for these women, how has this impacted their personal practices around dating, and specifically online dating and meeting people through apps, which is the way it happens now? I mean, it's hard to get around that if you're looking to meet someone. Have they dramatically changed their behavior?
Aria has tried to do some online dating, but then COVID just sort of made it too difficult, and she's a single mom, and she was like, you know what, I'm not, like, so she should have dropped off. And there's a story in episode 4 that I just heard that I might cut out because it doesn't really work, but I can tell it to you because it's funny. But in episode 4, we go to the police to try to charge Mark with fraud. And she's telling me the story that the night before she'd actually been on her first date since Mark, that she met the guy online. And she said to him, look, I know it's going to sound really weird, but can I see your ID? And the funny thing was, his ID did not match his name.
For what reason?
It was last year. I can't remember why.
Oh my gosh, what is wrong with people?
I know. And she was like, are you kidding me? It never went anywhere. It was never going to go anywhere. But I was just like, so we had quite a laugh about like, how could this happen? So she is going to date again once COVID's done, but she's going to be more careful. She is going to ask for ID, you know, and who thinks to ask for ID? But she will. And the other women, some of them I think are dating. It just took a little while. It's just taking longer.
I can't believe that she actually asked, which I think is fantastic and within her rights, and probably just expected him to show the ID with his name. And then it wasn't. It's like, are you kidding me? Unbelievable. So you go to the police station to try and file charges. Can you tell us if these were proper charges, that there was protocol to follow?
Yes, that's episode 4 that I think will be out by the time this podcast.
Oh, good.
All the women believed that there was rape because of lack of consent. Because how can you consent to somebody you don't know who they are? And there's a logic there, right? Like we have really had a lot of conversations lately about consent.
Interesting.
And if you believe that the only way to consent is to honestly be able to say yes to the person you know you're saying yes to, then there is a logic that this is sexual assault.
Wow.
In Canada right now, that is not the case. There is no law that says that. There's a few places in the United States where it's, because I know Americans have different laws state by state, which is different than Canada, but it's not straightforward. There's not a lot of places where lying about your identity takes away a consensual relationship.
Okay.
They kept saying this is domestic. It's not a criminal activity. But I did talk to a lawyer here in Canada who runs a violence against women focused clinic, and they believe that it's lack of consent and therefore illegal. And there's efforts underway to try to make those changes. You know, there are laws that say, like, if you don't tell somebody you're HIV positive, you can get into trouble. And so there's laws that can be drawn to this. There's a case in Australia of a guy who told a woman that he was a white male surfer dude, ended up meeting her, and he was not that. I think he was of Asian descent, shorter, everything, like physically not the same person, and different name and everything.
Yeah.
And he slept with her. She said she was scared, but he slept with her, and then she charged him, and he was actually found guilty of assault.
Wow.
Based on the lack of understanding of who he was. So there are places where that is starting to happen. And I think you need a groundswell. And I don't think that that's really been on too many people's minds yet. So the hope is that maybe this can bring that conversation forward.
Yeah, efforts to move that into the legislation conversation, because I think these stories are going to become less unique. Unfortunately, I think we're going to hear more and more of them, not less. So I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating story. I love how conversational and intimate it is. Is there anything else you want to spill or tease out? You may or may not speak with Mordechai Mark himself. The women are all okay, which that's something I'm happy to spoil and tell people. Anything else we should know about the podcast coming out?
I'm trying to think. I think I spilled more stuff than
than you meant to. Sorry.
I meant to, but yeah, no. I mean, there's still a lot to tell. Even though you'll have episode 4 by this point, there's still a lot to tell in the last few episodes. So yeah.
Okay, good. Well, something I ask all my guests before they go is, what gets you up in the morning? Literally, figuratively, both.
I really love, this is going to sound so silly. I love getting a cup of coffee, sitting on my living room couch or my porch when it's nice outside, listening to a podcast and playing Candy Crush by myself for 15 or 20 minutes, and then I can start my day. That is one of my favorite routines. It's lame because it's Candy Crush and everybody makes fun of me because I'm way too high up in the levels. But it's for me, that morning, it's mine and nobody can talk to me, and I put my headphones on and no one talks to me, and it's perfect. So that's what gets me up in the morning.
That doesn't sound silly at all. Those moments for mothers, for parents are bliss. So enjoy those, and thank you so much for being on Dialogue Podcast. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.